Colleagues, we're beginning the press conference of Foreign Minister of Russia, Sergey Lavrov, to take stock of 2016. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Happy New Year. And I congratulate you on all the holidays that have taken place. The previous year was quite a difficult one. It was a leap year, but apart from the usual troubles which we faced during leap years, there were some also man-made developments that didn't help facilitate greater international security. As far as the details are concerned of Russia's position, can be found in the new version of the Russian foreign policy strategy adopted by the President of Russia. And in November, I believe everyone who is interested in that has already got acquainted with that strategy. A lot of attention was paid to that. Thing to foreign policy was paid during the press conference of the President, so I'm not going to dwell too much on the outcomes of the previous year. I'd like to reserve more time for the question and answer session, and yet the challenges have not diminished. I refer in particular to the threat of international terrorism that has been acting ignobly. Many people of Europe and in the Middle East have been suffering from terrorism, and as a result of a terrible, heinous assassination, we lost our ambassador, Mr. Karlov. The problem of terrorism has become a systemic one, and the fact that so far the international community has failed to band together in reality and to come up with what Mr. Putin named a single universal anti-terrorist front when addressing the General Assembly as a source of great concern and regret. Why is that happening? Well, I believe there are many reasons to explain that. As we can see, creating a single front to fight organized crime, drug trafficking, terrorism, and a great number of other threats as becoming of systemic nature, and it's compounded by the basic contradictions between the objective trend towards the emergence of a polycentric world, that is what we're witnessing, on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's a contradiction with those who still cling to the obsolete concept of unipolarity. I refer in particular not just to the domination of one single state, but of one group of states with their own set of values. And in that regard, we are witnessing increasingly numerous contradictions that have been piling up for the last years. This factor has become very manifest right now. On the one hand, pragmatism, national interests can underlie the foreign policy. On the other hand, the foreign policy can be based on missionism, on a desire to promote one's values throughout the world. And these values are usually promoted in the form in which they have been formed in the country that is promoting them. Speaking about the European values, which always pointed out to us, are not the values that were professed by the forebears of Europeans. These values are something new. They have been brought up to modernity in a sense. They can be characterized as post-Christian values. And this is radically different from the values that we profess in our country, that we have adhered to for many centuries, from generation to generation, which we want to pass down to our children and to our grandchildren, cherishing them. When some countries put forward conditions when assessing political conflicts, making us take these new values, such as the absolutization of a secular approach towards the life of citizens. Well, I think that is absolutely indecent, but this is also a great mistake, speaking internationally. This is an absolutely inadmissible overestimation of one's own influence on the international arena. So we are witnessing these contradiction of two trends. On the one hand, this messianic obsession with the export of values, similar to the export of democracy, which we witnessed several years ago. And this trend is faced up with an increasing desire of serious politicians to focus on a pragmatic assessment of their own assessments, on the aspiration to grasp the legitimate interests of other countries, along with trying to find the similarity of approaches towards fighting terrorism, towards economic development, so that your own interests are not suffering from that. So we can continue with that list. So this contradiction between pragmatism and messianism and foreign policy is adding a new dimension to the controversies which we have been witnessing over the recent years. Russia's choice in that regard is well known. We are certainly not trying to export anything. The history of our country did have an experience of exporting a revolution, and since that time we stopped doing that, but bad examples are contagious, as is known. So these export of revolutions, export of values are still sowing discord and problems in the international relations. The attempts of European countries at exporting their own values has set off the Ukrainian crisis, the Arab Spring and the consequences which we are reaping right now. The Arab Spring, incidentally, has caused an import, but import of migration heading towards Europe. So these exports and imports do take place, unfortunately, and far from strengthening their security, they weaken it. Our choice is pragmatism based on the fundamental interests of Russia. These interests are very simple and they are permanent. They consist in achieving a good level of life of Russian citizens, of increasing the welfare, of achieving a sustainable economic and social development amid security and amid an environment which is as conducive as possible. This is our approach. Our position is far from being ideological. There is no place for messianism here. We are seeking coinciding interests with everyone who is willing to ensure the development of the world economy for the sake of all peoples, of all nations. We are seeking common ground together with those who understand that there is no alternative to fighting terrorism and other challenges of today. We are also trying to unite with those who are willing to work with us on an equal footing, on a mutually beneficial basis, with due respect for the interests of one another and the balance of these interests. These are the positions we've assumed in BRICS, in the CIS, in the SCO, in the United Nations, the CSTO, the Eurasian Economic Union, and a number of other multilateral platforms. And based on these positions, we also forge our alliances and relations with countries all over the world, be that individual countries or international integrational associations, on an equal footing and with due respect for the interests of one another, these principles can also become the basis of our relations with the US, the European Union, with NATO, without any import of values, without any attempts at obtruding their own values on us. Moreover, as the recent developments have shown us, these pseudo-values have discredited themselves, have been compromised, so to speak. I would like our conversation to be a frank one. I tried to express my own point of view at this stage of international life, so I'm ready to take your questions now. Anna Boldina, VGTRK. Good afternoon, Minister. In the course of the electoral campaign in the US and afterwards, there were accusations of Russia's interference. The Russian diplomats have been expelled. Could you elaborate a little bit on the change of conditions and the work of Russian diplomats? Have there been more attempts at recruiting Russian diplomats? Madam Zakharova recently spoke about that. Is there greater hidden pressure on diplomats who live abroad? You know, I think all diplomatic missions can tell you what the conditions are in which they work in this or that country. From time to time, under the Obama administration, we got complaints that the American embassy here was working in terrible, atrocious conditions, that the ambassador didn't get access to any Russian institutions, that surveillance was in place. We looked into that situation, and it turned out to be completely different, completely opposite. We took stock of all the contacts and compared them to the contacts of the Russian ambassador in the US with the government institutions of the US. And we also compared that to the contacts of the American ambassador in the Russian government institutions. And it turned out that our government institutions are more willing to receive the American ambassador than the US authorities are willing to receive the Russian ambassador. As far as recruitment is concerned, we didn't make public all the statistics in that regard, but recently, over the last years, especially under the second Obama administration, this unfriendly activity with regard to our diplomats was only growing. During her recent address on the TV, Maria cited an example when a diplomat from our consulate general there were attempts at recruiting him when he came to a medical facility to take up the medicine for Mr. Primakov. Certainly, you've got to be somewhat professionally impertinent and somewhat cynical to do something like that. But this is not a single example. There were also attempts in April last year. It was something unprecedented when there were attempts at recruiting the second person in the embassy. There were suggestions that he should work together with some foreign intelligence service. And there were other examples as well. The American Special Services were trying to recruit a diplomat, putting $10,000 US. They put that money into the car of that diplomat. By the way, this money is now working for the Russian Foreign Ministry. It has been given to our treasury. There were other attempts. A military attaché in Washington was having dinner with his family, with his spouse, and those diplomats were detained by the American FBI, and they were denied access to the telephone to call the embassy. Afterwards, they were released, but no apologies were made. Right now, moving on to claims that the American embassy was facing some persecutions here under the second Obama administration. Well, I do not think any grounds to say that that is what was happening. There were a number of episodes made public. Americans were trying to portray them as a witch hunt against the American diplomats. But as a matter of fact, it was completely different in reality. What we were trying to do is put an end to the intelligence activities of those who disguised themselves as the diplomats from the American embassy. There was an example, a case when a person was trying to penetrate into the American embassy. That person was disguised. He refused to show his credentials to the policeman who was stationed outside to protect the embassy, and he hit that policeman. There were some other cases when those intelligence men were disguising themselves as women or vice versa, and all that was documented. The military attaches of the American embassy here like to travel across our country using cars rented. They do not have the diplomatic plates. They have regular plates. They go through the Voronezh region, the Murmansk region, the Kaliningrad region. They were seen in Novorossiysk in the Chechen Republic on numerous occasions, and also on the border with Donbass. They explored every nook and cranny there. But apart from being engaged in espionage, the diplomats of the American embassy were seen on many occasions participating in the meetings of illicit rallies, sometimes disguised, not officially. You can make your own conclusions. I spoke about that once. 1993, November, the diplomatic relations between our country and the US are re-established, and the Foreign Minister Litvinov exchanges the official notes with President Roosevelt. These notes do not just state the re-establishment of the diplomatic relations. They also say, at the insistence of the US, and I emphasize that each and every side can organize their life as they see fit, and they commit themselves not to interfere within the domestic affairs of the other side and to control all the organizations preventing them from engaging in activities that can be threatening to the welfare and security of the other side, including such activities as propaganda with a view to changing the social regime and the political regime. This is almost a quote. It was implemented into the note re-establishing the diplomatic relations between the US and Russia at the insistence of the US side. In 2012, long before we were accused of interfering in the affairs of Syria and all the other capital sins, when, however, they started attacking and criticizing our foreign policy, our domestic policies, when foreign structures, platforms like the International Development Agency were active in Russia, I suggested to Hillary Clinton that we should once again put on paper our adherence to the principles that were enshrined in that note at the insistence of President Roosevelt to serve as a foundation for the relations between our countries. She politely avoided that A year later, John Kerry became State Secretary. I made the same suggestion to him, but he was not particularly enthusiastic about that either. So you can make your own conclusions. And remember that the commitment not to conduct any propaganda so as to change the political or the social regime, well, that principle is grossly violated, including through the law adopted by U.S. Congress on Ukraine. This law states that the American special services should obtrude their values on Russia. This is just a short remark to illustrate the need to observe the international law and to remember that if you've got a document signed by you and which has not been repealed, then you've got to observe it. It's been quite a lengthy remark, but that's not all I have to say about that. Sana, please. Good afternoon, Minister Lavrov, Sana Agency, Syrian Television. There are many forecasts, many declarations, many hopes that the Russian-US relations are going to improve once Donald Trump arrives in office. Should this all of a sudden happen, how is it going to affect the resolution of the Syrian crisis? Thank you.
Well, that was a short question, but the answering remark will be quite a long one. First of all, let us be quite realistic. We are closely watching the situation. We monitor how a new administration is getting ready for entering into office, and I would not like to say some radical things right now, because there are many forecasts, many speculations on that. It is said sometimes that nothing will change, sometimes that everything will change. It is probably premature to speak about it right now. Only once the new administration is in place and once it has started its operations, then finally we'll see how other further relations how the relations between the United States and the rest of the world will look like. I underline these are the relations between the US and the rest of the world, because Donald Trump's views are quite different from the views of his predecessors, both Democratic and Republican, and he bases on the interest for the United States as Donald Trump sees it. If we hear that in foreign policy Donald Trump will focus on countering terrorism, then we will welcome it. Because that is what we have lacked, what our American partners have lacked. Because in their remarks on some international platforms, they have cooperated with us and with our partners. They have worked out documents, but as a matter of fact, they deceived us when they promised to separate moderate opposition from Nusra, and they were quite liberal towards Nusra. And as we found out recently during a meeting of John Kerry with Syrian opposition representatives that took place several years ago, we found out that the US viewed ISIS as probably some moderate forces that can be useful to counter President Assad. And what we hear now from Donald Trump and from his team is a totally different approach, and presumably they will not use counterterrorism in order to achieve some tasks that have nothing to do with this primary aim. And when Donald Trump says that he'd like to focus on the US interests in the area of security, on the interests in creating some positive environment for American business, well, that is what President Putin bases on when he defines chief directions of Russia's foreign policy development. I would also like to know that there is one more topic that Donald Trump dwells on. He wants that each and every country is responsible for their own development, and that is what we approve of. We also think that the world needs more respect towards legal framework, towards the laws of each and every state. When Donald Trump says that his priority task is countering terrorism, I do hope that our cooperation on Syrian crisis and on some other pressing issues that are bound with countering terrorism will be much more effective than the cooperation we had with the Obama administration. After the president enters the office and his new secretaries, only after that we will be able to discuss our possible paths of cooperation on countering terrorism in Syria. But still, I can already say that the meeting in Astana that is about to take place, that was initiated by Russia, Turkey, and Iran, the meeting between the armed groups that signed the ceasefire agreement on the 29th of December and between the Syrian government. You know that this agreement has been approved of by UN Security Council. Syria, Turkey, and Iran act as guarantors of this agreement, and we are getting prepared for the meeting in Astana. And we think we should, and I have said about it on the 20th of December, we think it's appropriate to invite watchdogs from the United Nations and from US administration, taking into account that the meeting will take place on the 23rd of January. We hope that the new administration will be able to accept this invitation and will be represented on any level they think appropriate. And this will be the first contact, the first official contact, where we'll have an opportunity to start discussing how we can reinforce our actions to counter terrorism in Syria. Russia and the United States have established and headed the international group on Syria. It has not been dissolved. It has two subgroups. The first one on humanitarian issues, the second one on stopping any military action. And it is quite real to give some new impetus to the action of these mechanisms, given the claims by the new administration that they want to focus on countering terrorism. TV channel Kurdistan 24, Kurdistan 24. Good afternoon, TV channel Kurdistan 24. The meeting in Astana is about to take place, and we know that Russia plays an important role in Syrian situation. Are you ready to support the project of Syria, and will it guarantee the right of Kurds for a status of Kurdistan? Well, this is not a question For me, this is a question for the Syrians, because all the decisions taken by the UN during the recent years clearly stipulate that the fate of Syria can be decided only by Syrians themselves within an all-inclusive dialogue with participation of all confessional and ethnical groups of this state. Any foreign actors, the United States, Russia, or some other countries, according to UN resolution, they have to create all the circumstances that deem necessary in order to launch this inclusive Syrian dialogue. And that's what we have discussed, and that's what we have strived for during the recent year. But not all opposition groups of opposition were ready for that. There were some remarks of the High Committee on Negotiations, who wanted to give all the representation to the president, and thus the attempts of UN to conduct all Syrian negotiations were compromised. I think that one of the reasons why this negotiations process lost its momentum was that UN invited only political opposition members who were immigrants living in Europe or in some other countries, but not in Syria, and some inter-Syrian opposition members, and well, yes, and some Kurds. Though there were some politicians who represented Kurds who lived abroad, but all the groups representing Syria invited to negotiations by the UN were actually migrants. What these negotiations lacked was the absence there of those who really define the situation on the ground. They are what we call armed grooms, armed opposition. Now Russia and Turkey have launched an initiative to engage the warring parts into these negotiations. Now important agreements have been signed with military commandos. And thus, we have made a significant step forward. And now one of the major tasks of talks in Astana will be to consolidate a ceasefire regime and to agree on the fact that these warlords should be permanent members of further negotiation talks, of conducting elections, of working out constitution. This process was started, but then it came to a deadlock during Geneva talks. Now we think that warlords should be full-fledged members of this process. The issue should not be limited only by those groups who signed a ceasefire agreement on the 29th of December, but some other armed groups that may like to join these agreements should have such an opportunity. And we already have appeals from a number of militants who were not members of these agreements, but who would like to join them. So I think that all who really control the situation should be engaged. Azerbaijan media, please. You have a mic right next to your seat, yes. Press the button, please. Anar Gasamov, Azerbaijan TV. The year 2016 was marked by terrifying events in Nagorno-Karabakh. in case of a counter-terrorist operation on occupied territories, in case there is some cleansing from occupation forces, what will Russia's position be? Will Russia ignore it, or will it interfere with Azerbaijani affairs? Well, it is not an abstract notion. It is not a topic of Azerbaijani domestic policy. The conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh already has a number of decisions that were first of all taken in UN Security Council amid the conflict and that demanded ceasefire. And if you are interested in it, we may refer to archives and have a look at how these demands to start ceasefire were observed or not observed. And since this ceasefire entered into force with mediation of the Russian Federation, as you know, there is still a demand to make the occupied territories free, but not by force, and with defining a final status of Nagorno-Karabakh. That is what is enshrined in the documents developed by OSCE Minsk Group, by Russia, France, and United States, by pledges made by presidents of Russia, United States, and France, and by documents that were developed and signed by the presidents of Armenia and Azerbaijan. What is enshrined there is a peaceful way of settling any disputes. The fact that April 2016 witnessed some terrible events is what arouses our concerns, and Mr. President agreed with Mr. Aliyev in St. Petersburg in June 2016, taking into account some mutual accusation. Still, there was an agreement to increase the presence of OSCE watchdogs and the necessity to investigate all the incidents, and that was the topic in 2011 when presidents of Russia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia met in Astrakhan. But regrettably, even such an easy thing, and as I understand, you'd like such events never to happen again. But I repeat, such an easy thing as increasing the number of watchdogs and investigating all the incidents, these cannot be brought into life because there is no inner consensus in OSCE, and why it is so, well, we may ask them. Yes, please. Новое время, Armenia, the new time, Armenia. Новое время newspaper from Yerevan. Mr. Minister, you have already answered the question of our Azerbaijan colleague, so I'd be quite brief. Apart from numerous demands of Minsk Group on Nagorno-Karabakh, on non-use of force, on attempts to resolve Nagorno-Karabakh issue, well, given that background, there are two events. On the 29th of December, there were some clashes on the border between Armenia and Azerbaijan, not in Nagorno-Karabakh, which resulted in some victims. And later in Minsk, required by Azerbaijan, a Russian resident and who was also Israeli resident, was arrested, and it was done because he visited Nagorno-Karabakh. And because he said that in Nagorno-Karabakh people do have right to decide on their own fate. And then, as required by Azerbaijan, he was arrested in Belarus, and he has spent 2 months in Belarus prison already. But regrettably, we have heard nothing of the reaction of the Russian side, of the Russian population towards these events. So what is your estimation of what has happened on the 29th of December on the border between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and what is your estimation of the arrest of Russian citizen there? We are against criminalization of visits by journalists or by some individuals of some certain locations in some regions. Then we are against sending people who have been taken into custody in Russia to in one country to other countries. So we know that this man was an Israeli citizen, and he stood in contact with Israeli diplomats, and we took measures to dissolve this situation, respecting the rights of a Russian citizen who is simultaneously an Israeli citizen.
In this regard, let me add one more point. As you know, Russia and Belarus have an alliance within which principal decision was adopted to level up the rights of citizens of both countries in every field, and one of these areas of our joint efforts is agreement on parameters of the single visa space. This requires from us a single migration space. It also requires from us determining and making single lists of persons, of non grata persons, persona non gratas, and we hope that it is especially relevant today, since there is a question of agreement between Belarus and EU about camps for illegal migrants on the territory of Belarus, and since we have no land border with Belarus, no documented land border with Belarus, we are starting a dialogue with our colleagues from Belarus regarding this issue. We've been talking a lot about single migration policies. And I think that all these developments now demand from us to speed up our joint efforts and to yield some results. But let me repeat, our citizen who was detained by Belarus, we do have consular access to our citizen, and together with the Israelis as representatives of his country of second citizenship, we are working closely with Israel. Estonian television, you have the floor. Thank you very much. Nebradas, Estonian television. Our question to you, Minister Lavrov, concerns the border between Estonia and Russia. 3 years ago, the treaty on border was signed, but still the stadium has not ratified this document, and because the moment is not opportune. My second question is, what is your attitude to new NATO troops emerging near this border? As for NATO troops, I think it's bad. No one really needs it. And if this NATO security structures do not see any other use for themselves as near the border, the Russian-Estonian border, then probably their intelligence is not working that well, and they do not know well what's going on in other NATO responsibility zones. As for the border treaty, it's an interesting story. Back in 2005, I and Urma Spite, ex-foreign minister, signed the treaty on border, on land border, on lake border, and there was a clear understanding and agreement that those treaties would be ratified without any provocative amendments, without any language which would contain any territorial claims. This was 100% guaranteed, but when the treaties were about to be ratified by the Estonian parliament, the MPs one day before the end of the spring session adopted the law on ratification, making a reference to the law of 1824 containing complaints against the Russian Federation. And in this situation, we asked our Estonian colleagues, if you understood that you did not have enough votes for ratification in the way that had been agreed upon, why did you not repeal this law? Why did you not wait for the next session to make some clarifications? There's been no answer. Many years after, together with Urma Spite and I agreed to re-sign the treaty. We've launched the ratification procedure. We signed them once again in Moscow. We agreed to exchange instruments of ratification in Tallinn. It's the only ex-Soviet capital where I've never been as Minister of Foreign Affairs, but at the same time we have agreed that for the sake of ratification we need to make sure that there is conducive environment, some good environment, and as we understood, this good environment was about the absence of any accusations against each other, any mutual allegations that Russia is posing a danger to Estonia and all other countries of the region and Eastern Europe in general. But unfortunately, when this treaty was already submitted to the Committee on International Affairs of the Russian State Duma, hearing on the treaty took place, and the rhetoric from Tallinn was absolutely unacceptable. To make sure this process continues, and we are ready to go back to ratification. Our MPs have repeated this on numerous occasions because MPs feel the mood of the public and they are the ones who are to make the decision. We will support this process, but only amid those conditions when our relationship is developing constructively and not when confrontation is being stepped up. Greek television, please. Afanasyev Garinach. Mega television. We're broadcasting in Cyprus and Greece. Mr. Lavrov, you're one of the most experienced diplomats and foreign ministers in the world. So the issue of settlement in Cyprus, this is a long-standing issue which is becoming more and more relevant. Talks are underway, but it seems that Russia is somehow keeps away from these negotiations. Our public opinion, our public often asks us, have there been any requests from the Cypriot or Greek government concerning your involvement in this process of settlement, and what is your assessment of this settlement? And there is one more question regarding this situation in our region. Russia and Greece, of course, closely interlinked. There is a traditionally good, friendly relationship between Russia and Greece, but there is a feeling that some forces are trying to spoil this good environment. Recently, Greek journalists have found out that despite the kind words, the Greek government has refused to refuel the Russian warship which was on its way to Syria. I think that was the first case of such nature, and at the end of 2016, a Russian ambassador was expelled from the Russian embassy in Athens, and Russia responded with the same measure, expelling the member of the Greek embassy from Moscow. So could you please provide comments on that? As concerns the last question, then it's, if your information is correct, then it's 1-1, and there is a draw. As for refueling of our warships that are providing supplies to Russian airspace forces and the base in Maymim and the facilities in Tartus, we've managed with this situation, and we have an opportunity, without placing any additional burdens on our colleagues, to ensure operation of our airspace forces and of our navy. As for the settlement in Cyprus, I've been dealing with this issue for a long time, since the issue of Cyprus has always been the focus of attention of the UN Security Council, including because of the UN temporary forces whose mandate is being extended by the UN Security Council on a regular basis, and the co-authors, such resolutions on extension of mandate or settlement of the Cypriot problem has always been co-authored by permanent members of the UN Security Council. And when I was terminated my office as the permanent representative at the UN, there were expectations quite similar to the current UN meeting in Geneva. These expectations had to do with the so-called Kofi Annan's plan, who was the UN Secretary General back then, who proposed that the parties should agree to a referendum, while with the key problems remaining unagreed. So what he proposed was to preserve those disagreements, to keep those disagreements, with the understanding that the positive vote would give the UN the role to solve the issues that have been unsolved, and the UN would decide the issues of property, of land. And back then I met with the leadership of Cyprus, with Cypriot leaders who came in New York, and they were sure that such acute problems that are dividing Greeks and Cypriots would be wrong, and Kofi Annan's plan was supported, but it failed. So if you mean that my position at that moment reflected my experience, well, maybe, but why did I say that? The reason for that is that I want to emphasize that right now the attempts to create this positive environment are not always right, are not always productive, and I've seen this overwhelming optimism during the preparation for the meeting in Geneva. I've talked to Cypriot colleagues, to Greek colleagues. We're keeping close touch with everyone, and answering their question on how we would see the preparation of this conference, we said that talking about an international event where guarantees would be discussed, the best guarantees for a united Cyprus would be the UN Security Council guarantees, and not the guarantees of 1, 2, or 3 countries. And both Greek and Cypriot colleagues agreed with that opinion, and they showed their interest in involving into the conference 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. But other stakeholders probably did not want to see that format work, which makes me think about the intention of some partners to leave aside the option in accordance with which the security of Cyprus will be guaranteed by the UN Security Council. As I believe this is wrong, but we would be ready to support any agreements which the Cypriots themselves achieve between the two communities. And TV channel, please. Mr. Lavrov, Donald Trump has recently said in an interview that he would be ready, in principle, to consider the lifting of sanctions, the deal of the lifting of sanctions in exchange for nuclear disarmament. What do you think about this? Well, besides that, we need to wait for inauguration. As you understand, I do not want, and I'm not eligible to interpret what Donald Trump said in his interview, but in these words that you have quoted, I've heard quite a different sense. He said, I don't remember precisely what he said, but as I remember and as I've heard it, he said that he would be thinking about what to do with sanctions. That is one part of the phrase, and the second part was that if it is possible to do some mutually beneficial things together with Russia, then this issue should be solved. And among good things, useful things, as I, Donald Trump, see are future steps in nuclear disarmament. I have not seen here any deal to disarm in exchange for the lifting of sanctions. As for nuclear armaments and strategic stability and nuclear parity and strategic parity, these issues are one of the key issues in the US-Russian relationship, and it is quite clear for me that the president-elect, talking about Russia, mentioned the nuclear arsenal. It is my conviction that for us too, one of our priorities would be to resume the dialogue on strategic stability with Washington that was disrupted by the Obama administration, which has broken so many parts and has destroyed so many useful mechanisms that it's even hard to count them. The dialogue on strategic stability, although the Obama administration tried to propose that we resume it, we did have a meeting with the Obama administration, but the main dialogue that we are to have is with the Trump administration. But we need to understand that to engage into this dialogue on the steps that should be done to decrease the threats to security, we need to take into account all factors that have influence on strategic stability, and there are a lot of such factors besides nuclear armaments. These include non-nuclear strategic hypersound armaments, which can reach any target at any place of the world without any nuclear re-entry vehicles. And secondly, these includes anti-missile defense program, which transforms the strategic balance, and we need to agree on how to make sure that these changes in the strategic balance do not destabilize the situation. Another factor is the plans of the current administration and of the previous administration to place arms in outer space, there are other factors as well. For example, the US refusal to ratify the Treaty on Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban. All these package, maybe I have forgotten to mention something, all these package has an influence on strategic balance globally and on strategic parity globally. And we'll be ready as soon as the new US administration enters into office. We would be ready to meet with them, to talk to them in a business-like way, feeling the responsibility with regard to the people of our countries and to the global community. Iceland radio, please. Minister Lavrov, Happy New Year. I wish every success to the Russian Foreign Ministry. Many think that it is necessary for the leaders of two superpowers to meet, for Putin and Trump to meet. Sunday Times wrote that the meeting in Reykjavik was about to take place between Moscow and Washington. What information do you have in that regard? And how could you comment on that information? Well, I can comment on that the way it was commented in Moscow and Washington, it is out of touch with reality. There have been no contacts to discuss such plans. Kazakhstan, please. Minister Lavrov, the development of the Eurasian Economic Community over the last year has been quite forced. What do you think is the reaction of Europe to this, and what would your advice be how to develop the Eurasian space at this level? My second question would be, there has been a change of power in Uzbekistan recently. What do you think could be the future of the relationship between Russia and Uzbekistan?
As far as the relations between Russia and Uzbekistan are concerned, they have long been the relationship of strategic partnership and alliance, despite the fact that several years ago Uzbekistan withdrew from the CSTO. We still have a bilateral alliance which is enshrined in an international legal instrument. We believe that the new president, the new leadership of the country, are certainly willing to maintain cohesion and continuity in our relations, and we welcome that. We do hope that additional opportunities will pop up to deepen the relationship between Russia and Uzbekistan, and also with other neighbors based on international platforms and structures. I do hope these potentials are going to be used, are going to be tapped for the sake of our nations and peoples. Now, concerning the Eurasian Economic Union, this is a dynamic process which is developing stage to stage. As you know, recently a new customs code has been adopted which decreases the time and the costs which are needed to declare the goods, to process them. The number of documents is decreasing that is needed for the goods to go through the border. We've got a single market for pharmaceuticals and medical goods. By 2025, we've got to have a single energy market, an electricity market. So, in spite of all the difficulties we're up against related to the current economic conditions, in spite of the difficulties and the negotiations within the Eurasian Economic Union, I believe this is quite a promising integration association, and some concrete results have already been achieved, and that our citizens have felt the advantages of our countries participating in the Eurasian Economic Union. The interests in the Eurasian Economic Union that is shown by other third parties as yet another testimony to how promising this association is. Right now, around 15 negotiations are underway, both with separate countries and other organizations, on establishing ties with Vietnam. As you know, an FTA was signed. Right now, talks are underway to conclude an intergovernmental agreement on trade and economic cooperation with China. Negotiations have been launched on an FTA with Israel. A so-called study group has been set up. Right now, discussions are ongoing like that with Egypt, Serbia, Singapore, Iran. Certainly, these processes have to be viewed in a broader context of concepts and ideas formulated by President Putin last year. I refer to the concepts related to promoting the so-called Greater Eurasian Project. That's the project that might encompass, on the basis of different forms of cooperation, the countries of the Eurasian Economic Union, the SCO, as well as ASEAN nations. Incidentally, the secretariats of all these three structures, the SCO, ASEAN, and the Eurasian Economic Union, met in Sochi in May this year in the sidelines of the Russia-ASEAN summit, which testified once again to the interest the Southeast Asian countries show in fostering cooperation. There are separate ASEAN countries that want to strike an FTA with the Eurasian Economic Union, but apart from that, ASEAN as an organization in general also contemplates this opportunity. These processes also encompass the cooperation with a view to integrating the Eurasian economic integration and the new Silk Road project. If I'm not mistaken, you asked about Europe's attitude towards that cooperation. Let me say first and foremost that in November 2015, the Eurasian Economic Union Commission submitted a proposal to Brussels to establish contacts with the European Commission so as to talk about the ways to work in a mutually beneficial manner to boost trade, investment. So far, there's been no reply from Brussels. We assume we get information through different channels, which tells us that the European Union doesn't view the Eurasian economic integration process as a full-fledged one. They believe our integration is based on ideology, and it's the embodiment of Russia's desire to grasp new spheres of influence. In my introductory remarks, I spoke about a certain foreign policy mentality, mindset, which is based on messianism and based on the need to promote the values in the form in which our European partners understand them. So accusations leveled against Russia that it is allegedly trying to tear away the neighboring countries from the European values are voiced not just by separate journalists, but also by officials, by dignitaries. You know, Brzezinski wrote a book, The Grand Chessboard. I believe certain politicians of today are still guided by Brzezinski's creed with regard to Eurasia. Back then, in his book, he wrote, speaking about Eurasia, that everything had to be done to prevent the barbarians from banding together. That's the characteristic he gave to us, probably not so impolitely, but still, I think many politicians of today do not want the Eurasian integration project to happen at all. Yet another example, let's take Serbia. You know, Serbia wants to engage in talks with the Eurasian Economic Union to talk about an FTA, but the European Union is sending signals to the end I mentioned. There is this woman, Natalie Toccia, an advisor to Madame Mogherini. He said that the relations between Serbia and Russia was the greatest challenge for Serbia as far as Serbia's alignment with the foreign policy of the European Union was concerned. This was not about the relationship between Belgrade and the Eurasian Economic Union. This was said in the context of Serbia's adhesion to the European Union, but it testifies to the fact that nothing has changed over the last 1.5 decades. Each and every partner is viewed by Brussels as a country which has to make a choice whether you are with Russia or whether you are with the European Union. This is absolutely counterproductive, and yet, regrettably, it is still the prevalent logic in Europe. As I mentioned, the Eurasian Economic Commission said a level inviting the European Commission to cooperate, but I do hope that sooner or later, at least politeness, courtesy, which has always been one of the values, is going to make them give us an answer. NBC, please. The US.
Just picking up on a colleague's question, Donald Trump spoke a few days ago about sanctions as well as nuclear weapons, and he seemed to link the two together. Are you prepared to do some kind of a grand deal with Donald Trump on these issues? And also, secondly, not a message to Donald Trump, not a message to the administration, but as he prepares to take office, what's Russia's message to America? Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm certainly somewhat confused because I think I've already answered these two questions. I've answered the first one for sure. I told you about my view of our relations in the context of strategic stability, and I told you what I inferred from Donald Trump's speech when he was speaking about three things. First, the need to address the sanctions. Second, the need to see positive avenues of cooperation with Russia. And he also said that one of these avenues might be the dialogue on strategic nuclear weapons. So I didn't see any deal lurking behind those words about disarmament in exchange for sanctions. As far as the signal, the message we'd like to send to the US, we want prosperity for the American people, as for any other people, any other nation. And as I said earlier today, we understand if Donald Trump wants to concentrate his activities inside and outside the country on that pursuit. If what Donald Trump and his team say about their willingness to search together with Russia for common approaches to address the shared problems we are up against, to overcome the threats, if that is the position of the new administration, then we are going to reciprocate. We are going to accept that. And President Putin has said that on numerous occasions. And this position is not linked to who is at the helm in the US. We are willing to cooperate with anyone who is willing to do that on the basis of equal rights and respect for mutual interest. Before I give the floor to the first speaker, we have not yet had questions from Asia. Please, correspondence, Germany first. Germany? Thank you. German Information Agency. My name is Thomas Eben. I've got two questions. First, could you please tell us, isn't it sad that you're going to lose Franklin Steinmeier and John Kerry as your official counterparts in talks? And the second question, right now in the run-up to elections in Germany, there is so much talk about hacker attacks from Russia. What can you do to prove that Russia is not to blame, that Russia is no threat? Thank you very much. Indeed, I think Frank Steinmeier and John Kerry, we've got very warm, friendly relations with both of them. I do hope that we're going to keep those relations regardless of and what capacity each and every one of us is going to serve in future. Well, at least both Frank Walter and John know that. They know that is the position I have assumed, and as far as I understand, they share that position of mine. So I wish to both of them success in their new capacity. Regarding cybersecurity and the accusations leveled against us, to be frank, I'm not going to prove to you why all of this is not true. I believe that in Germany, just as in many other countries, there is this principle that you are innocent until proven guilty. You are the ones to prove that we are to blame. We saw some very far-fetched attempts at blaming us, at proving right now the British are saying they have nothing to do with that. Their colleagues from the US also say the same. They tried to spoil it for the new administration. Some defector from MI6. I can go on for long. All TV shows right now are full of talks, very heated debates about these terrible, just atrocious claims that discredit Europe and the US that is also engaged in that process. We can go on ad infinitum about the absurdity, the far-fetched nature of these accusations. Some facts are even telling of lies, but I'm not going to dwell on that. We believe that international cybersecurity, and that is our position, is something that should be a concern to each and every one of us. And Russia precisely has always championed the need to foster a sustainable cooperation to achieve order and to fight cybercrime. Incidentally, we submitted a proposal to that and to the UN, to the OSCE. In particular, we came up with a draft convention to fight crime in the information space. That convention would allow us to penalize hacker attacks. But what they're telling us is that everything is fine. We don't need that. There is the Budapest Convention, which was adopted by the Council of Europe back in 2001, which allows interfering within the domestic affairs of countries without their consent, and nothing else is required. But since that time, since 2001, drastic changes have taken place. So all these cries that cybersecurity of the West is under threat is yet another testimony to the double standards that exist in this field. So the very same persons who refuse to work with a view to establishing universal rules, to add some order to cyberspace, to the information space, to fighting together against cybercrimes. So the very same person accuses, without any proof, that we have allegedly taken control of half the world through our actions. Just recently, when speaking about that, I read there was a piece of news from the BBC channel. The US is creating allegedly a special counterintelligence group which has long been looking into financial ties between Donald Trump and Russia. This group comprises the FBI, the NSA, the Director of National Intelligence, the Justice Department, the Finance Department. So allegedly they have all been collecting evidence supporting the claim that Donald Trump allegedly has financial ties to Russia. If all this team of distinguished institutions have only been able to come up with what they've made public right now, then They are deserving of a dismissal from their posts because they are not doing anything to get the money they are getting. I'm not going to prove that we have anything to do with that. Chinese television, please. Good afternoon, Minister. Happy New Year. We all remember that a year ago you congratulated our Chinese colleagues on the forthcoming spring holiday. Back then you also said a couple of words about the cooperation between China and Russia. You named this cooperation as one of the main factors ensuring international security. Just recently, the spokesperson of the Chinese Foreign Ministry, for one, emphasized that China wants to further strengthen and develop the comprehensive strategic partnership of our country so as to ensure peace, security in the region and throughout the whole world. So my question is as follows. What do you think about our cooperation? What is your assessment? What do you think about our cooperation in the Middle East, the Korean Peninsula, and in the fight against terrorism over the last year? And what do you expect in the domain of diplomatic interaction in future? And if you don't mind, yet another question about Syria. As we all know, in 2016, Russia did a lot to settle the domestic conflicts and to promote political negotiations in Syria. And in this regard, the international community is hopeful that progress is going to be achieved once talks take place in Astana. Could you please tell us what the achievements are and what losses Russia has suffered as a result of the progress launched last year in settling the Syrian crisis? Thank you.
Thank you. We have probably the best relations with China now since mutual relations between the countries have been established. I mean, bilateral strategic cooperation and partnership, then partnership in regional, in global issues. They are on the uprise. And we are convinced, and our Chinese partners support us, that Moscow and Beijing's actions coordination on global arena is one of the key factors to support stability in the world. For that reason, we are aimed to continue this cooperation when President Putin made an official visit to Beijing in June. A number of important documents was signed on economic cooperation, on foreign policy cooperation. A statement was made on global strategic stability, a statement on cooperation in informational space. This is as far as the topic of cybersecurity is concerned. And the declaration of foreign ministers was adopted on the role of international law. So you can see the attention paid by our diplomats to the situation in global arena, and the situation on the Arabian Peninsula, the initiatives to resume negotiations process have been launched, and given the firm position of the global community of not allowing China to become a nuclear power state and to prohibit any test missile launches, the peninsula should not become a point of threat. The crisis there should not be used to increase ammunition and to raise the intensiveness of any test launches that may take place there. And for that matter, the position of Russia and China is absolutely clear, and the task is to convince other members of negotiations to support the position. As for the situation in Syria, Russia and China have always coordinated their activities, including the issues of countering terrorism. Apart from United Nations, anti-terrorist programs are present in SCO and in BRICS. Russia and China play an important role in both of these organizations. You have asked to estimate our achievements and our losses in Syria. We are convinced that we have done right when we gave a positive response towards the appeal of a UN member state, a state where a capital was nearly occupied by terrorists, and the fact that we managed to somehow withdraw terrorists from Damascus and to bring liberty to Aleppo is very important. Firstly, to save Syria as a multinational and multi-confessional secular state, as demanded by UN Security Council resolution. Those who kept silent and just watched 1.5 years ago as ISIS and some other bandits encircled Aleppo, well, those very people committed, well, probably a crime, because they violated the UN Security Council resolution, which demanded not to let Syria become an Islamist state. Well, as for our losses, they are known to everybody. We know about the losses of our air forces, about the doctors who not long ago were about to fly to Syria to wish a Happy New Year to our military servicemen. Yes, these are very sad losses, but we're convinced that our heroes let their name be enshrined in the history of countering terrorism. Yes, please, you have the floor. Thank you very much. Russian-Japanese relations in recent years have been marked by the official visit of President Putin, which took place in December. Could you please tell us what is your vision of the results of this visit? The second question is much more definite. It concerns some common activities in Kurila Islands. The implementation of the plans here is quite a difficult task. So what is your estimation of it? I think that the major result of the visit was an unambiguous confirmation of our mutual striving to improve our relations and to lead them to a new level, regardless of any other circumstances. It is a principal point because we are all aware how much pressure has been executed against Japan on the part of the US outgoing administration. Even here, they tried to undermine perspective of normal relations. Attempts were made to prevent Japanese government from dialogue, from cooperation with Russian president, and the number of such contacts was reduced. While the outgoing US administration have not behaved properly in this regard, and they tried to abuse their relations with Japan and tried to treat their Japanese partners as some second-level members of the global community. So given this background, we reiterate our commitment to improve our relations and to lead them to a new level, and this is very important. The President and Prime Minister have agreed to continue negotiations on establishing a peace treaty, and this is what our negotiations team will deal with on the level of ministers. As you have said, a priority should be made out of some definite criteria of our common activities. Add to this a facilitation of visits. I mean the residents of the islands and members of their families who probably visit the graves of the members of their families, and the process to facilitate it is already in place. After the visit of Mr. Putin to Japan, Moscow was visited by the Minister of Economy of Japan, Mr. Seko, who met his colleagues, his counterparts. As a result, 12 intergovernmental agreements were signed, about 70 commercial agreements. Among them, the creation of Russian-Japanese Investment Foundation. We have a very positive impression of the visit because the goals were clearly stated. The steps to achieve them will not be easy, and that is what the President said at his press conference, taking into account some difficulties connected with the peace treaty. However, those difficulties should be overcome, and we should base on the fundamental interests of the Russian and the Japanese peoples, regardless of any attempts of the third countries to interfere with the process, but to understand that it will be a great deal of work. Ukraine, Roman Simvaluk, please. You have the floor. 10 minutes past 10 now. Thank you. You have cited Mr. Putin's words, and among others, he said that Russia has to protect Russian-speaking population in the Crimea. Could you please tell us where these clauses are stipulated in Minsk agreements and in memoranda? And then, is Russia ready? Could you please repeat the question? How can Russia probably amend its position towards the Crimean situation? Well, you're an experienced journalist. Probably you should have asked whether Russia is ready at all. Well, yes, is Russia ready at all to amend its position? Well, we have discussed these points many times, and we have discussed the correspondence with what happened, with obligations of Ukraine, Minsk memoranda. contains only one obligation. It states that the nuclear weapons will not be launched against Ukraine. This is the single thing that is stipulated in the Protocol of 1994. This is the political statement. However, there are some other statements that we will be respecting the integrity and the sovereignty of Ukraine as a state. The thing that lacks in Budapest Protocol is Russia's commitment to comply with the results of an armed coup d'etat whose authors made their priority task out of countering Russian language and countering Russians in the Crimea. It was said that the Russian language should be actually ruined, demolished in the Crimea. And nobody promised to comply with such statements. And when saying about ruining the agreement of the 20th February 2014, given the failure to protect the agreement guaranteed by France, Poland, and Germany, the Ukrainian putschists actually violated Budapest Protocol, the provisions on sovereignty and integrity of the state. I have no intent to amend the existing provisions that are enshrined according to US Security Council resolution. I haven't heard that France or Germany as Normandy formate states, or that Donetsk or Luhansk regions as members of the contact group suggested that we should amend those provisions. Quite on the contrary, the global community keeps repeating that there is no alternative to Minsk agreements. Yes, in Ukraine on a high segment level, statements are being made that nobody will be fulfilling those agreements, that they should be amended, that the United States should be invited to participate in Normandy format. We are all aware of it, and we know that Obama administration tried to support the fulfillment of this agreement, and it brought certain use, but well, ended in no particular result. I haven't heard that Donald Trump's team said that we need to bury those agreements and solve the Ukrainian problem by some other way. So there is no need to think it over. Serbia, please. Serbian news agency Beta News. I'd like to ask a question. Several days ago, there was an intent to send a new train to Kosovo that was colored into national colors and had painted letters and words saying that Kosovo is Serbia. The train was stopped and reversed to Belgrade. It was viewed as a provocation, that as an intent of Serbia to annexate a part of Kosovo, and the president of Serbia afterwards threatened Pristina that he would that he would deploy troops to Kosovo. And a week ago, Milorad Dodik stated that there was an intent to secede from Bosnia and Herzegovina and to join Serbia, afterwards to join Kosovo and some parts of Montenegro. What is your estimation of the situation? Some experts say that the region is on the edge of war again. Regrettably, the Balkans have many times become a source of grave, serious conflicts. We know that history teaches us that it teaches nothing, but still I do hope that this time everybody will understand the necessity not to let in any sort of force employment. So here I'd like to go back to my introductory remark. Such situations are brought about by the policy of those who try to impose the so-called European values on the Balkan states, and these are the values just wrapped up in some new wrapping paper. As for Kosovo, I received concrete information, and we analyzed what really happened there. And there's only one thing I may say: the European Union should somehow de-escalate this situation and guarantee the fulfillment of agreements between Belgrade and Pristina, in which it is stated that the freedom of movement of people should not be limited, and that in the north of Kosovo, where Serbians live, should not be any Albanian force structures.
And as I believe some of these agreements have been violated. As for the statements made by Miroslav Dodik, we are in favor of implementing the Dayton agreements, and Dodik has always been confirming his adherence to the Dayton agreements. At the same time, we reminded our Western partners on numerous occasions that it is already indecent and impolite to keep in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is considered an independent state, the so-called High Representative, who has the rights of a general governor and can impose on 3 peoples any decisions. Several years ago, Bosnia and Herzegovina was the non-permanent member of the UN Security Council, but the European Union still cannot abandon this, the office of High Representative, and this is irritating, as well as the fact that inside Bosnia and Herzegovina, the Serbian figures are being accused of destroying this state. Let me underscore, no one is destroying this state. Miroslav Dodik has confirmed his adherence to the Dayton agreements on many occasions, but the Dayton agreements are being violated by those who try to adopt decision in Bosnia and Herzegovina without taking into consideration the opinion of all 3 peoples. And that is the essence of the Dayton agreements. And when there is hysteria about the decision of Bosnian Serbs to declare the 9th of January as the holiday, as the day of the national culture, and when it is being said that this is undermining the Dayton agreements, this is just another provocation, and this is just someone feeling somehow hurt by someone recognizing their own values instead of post-Christian values. Good afternoon, Boris Anzov, Bulgaria. I have two questions, Mr. Minister. My first question is about the situation in the Middle East, and the second is about Russian monuments in Bulgaria. I've been in Iraq for a month covering the battle for Mosul, and I have witnessed there that from Syria to Iraq, Christians being suppressed. And in an interview with me, General Servan Basrami from Peshmerga said that until there is a political will in this region, killings will continue in the region. He said, my people are military people. This is my first question. My second question is that he also said after the victory of Daesh stands for Islamic State. He said, what is going to happen next? He said, after Daesh, there will be a new Daesh. That is my first question. My second question is, there are 3,400 graves of Russian soldiers in Bulgaria. I've made a movie about these graves. If we Bulgarians do not care about these graves, maybe you will pay your attention to these graves. General Solofinarov is also buried there in one of those graves. And maybe you could pay your attention to this. So my question is, what were these people done for, so that we had olives from Greece and strawberries from England in Bulgaria? So thank you very much. As for the graves of soldiers, if you could provide me with the information, I would be really grateful to you. This issue was discussed already. Yes, thank you. I understand. We've never heard about such problems with graves of Russian and Soviet soldiers. We do have our state system, which is maintaining the graves. This has been done partially on the basis of bilateral intergovernmental agreements. In other cases, military graves are being taken care of through the Military Memorial Society efforts, and civil graves are being taken care of by the Rossотрудничество agency. And based on your data, I want to understand what category these graves belong to. Are they a subject of the Russian-Bulgarian bilateral agreement, or do they belong to some other category? We pay special attention to preserving the memory of all our soldiers who died liberating Europe and Bulgaria from Turkey, and during the 2 world wars on the European continent, many Russian heroes died. So I would be really grateful to you for the information that you've just mentioned. As for the situation in the Middle East, we're really concerned about the exodus of Christians. Their number in Iraq has decreased by 4 times, as well as in Syria and in other parts of the regions. The life of Christians is not easy. Today we have already mentioned how this crisis broke out. This is a result of an export of democracy and of values, which these efforts came from Europe, but first of all they hate Christians. And these is another demonstration for me that these values that have been exported from Europe are post-Christian values, because the stake was made at overthrowing the so-called authoritarian regimes which do not fit the category of handshaking governments based on liberal philosophy. And when in the 1980s the US supported Mojahids, Al-Qaeda emerged. After, in 2003, Iraq was occupied. The Islamic State came into being. And this is the same situation which we're witnessing now in the Syrian crisis. One of affiliates of Al-Qaeda, Jabhat al-Nusra, is one of the most brutal barbarian terrorist forces today. You know, putting an end to this war, ensuring the rights of Christians and Muslims and of other people who've been living their whole life in Syria and in other regional countries can be done through the use of force, because terrorism must be destroyed and eliminated. That is what we are doing by helping the Syrian army and those militants, militia who, together with the Syrian army, are involved in counter-terrorism operations. I invite you to take a look at statistics. Only after last September, Russian airspace forces, at the request of President al-Assad, started their operation in Syria. Only after that, the US coalition, the US-led coalition, which had been in existence for almost a year, started to bomb ISIL, to shell at ISIL, to shell their infrastructure, including oil fields, which the Islamic State used to finance its operations through smuggling. And there are a lot of examples testifying to the fact that both al-Nusra and ISIL, that there were intentions to use al-Nusra and ISIS to weaken and to overthrow Assad's regime. Therefore, they've been taking this very cautious position about implementing the goal that was stated by them of fight against terrorism. The second area which is of priority for us is mobilizing the public opinion, the global public opinion, and we have already held 3 events, 3 conferences to protect Christians in Geneva. This initiative was put forward by Russia, the Holy See, Lebanon, and Armenia. No EU countries joined the initiative. Probably protecting Christians is considered politically incorrect in today's Europe. Well, you know that fundamental documents of the EU, including draft constitution and the Treaty of Lisbon, that the phrase was removed from these fundamental documents that Europe has Christian roots. This spring we are about to have another conference. Yes, this is just a conference, but mass media can use this conference to draw attention to the awful situation that the Christians are now facing, as well as people of other religion in the Middle East. I think this is very important. And besides the UN, within the OSCE, we've been supporting the decisions of the OSCE ministers on anti-Semitism, on fight against anti-Semitism. And last year we suggested that, along with the declaration on fight against anti-Semitism, we adopt a similar document on fight against Islamophobia or Christianophobia. And within the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, there is still no consensus in order to adopt a document against Islamophobia and Christianophobia. So the problem is still there. We know what it is. We take every possible effort to neutralize the existing problem, to solve the existing problem. I urge the European mass media to have a look at their own capitals, at what position with regard to Christians your governments are taking, no matter where these Christians are living in Russia today, TV channels. So people are to blame for everything. Is this a hashtag? Good afternoon, Minister Lavrov. My name is Ilya Petrenko. I would also like to congratulate you on New Year and Christmas. My question is about a number of stories that have been included in many Western mass media. For example, reports on compromising information against Donald Trump, the absurdity of which has already been recognized by many in the United States, including the intelligence community. A lot has been said about it. Let's move on. But just yesterday, BBC TV channel showed a documentary in prime time where the so-called Moscow dossier, where 10 minutes were actually devoted to the so-called Moscow dossier, or maybe even more. The German colleague has already mentioned the word hackers today, and there is a sense that in Germany the word hacker is turning into a buzzword. The German mass media have recently used one of the examples to has once again used the story about the girl named Lisa to show how awful Russian propaganda use, what a boogeyman it is. So what is your comment? I've already touched on this issue. This hysteria is based on something more than the willingness to somehow spoil the relationship between Donald Trump and Russia. These are the efforts being made by those who understand that their time is coming to an end, and who understand that promoting the liberal values in every possible area in foreign policy would not be possible, because serious people do not want to be involved into this performance. They want to be dealing with the problems of their countries, of their nations, and the time of foreign policy populism is over. This is painful, therefore fakes are being created. I don't know where this is appropriate to say in Russian. Well, fakes are being invented, and it's quite simple. First, some officials stovepipe some fakes into mass media. They leak some information into mass media. Then this information is being spread through mass media, and then comments are being made by the very same officials as something given. We've seen this from numerous examples. This concerns the girl that you've mentioned, and this so-called white helmets, which BBC nominated for the Nobel Prize, and then videos emerged showing how these white helmets are staging all these horrors that were later spread through TV channels and internet. This also regards the hysteria of our Western colleagues in the UN Security Council, who were demanding from us to make the Syrian government led through convoys with medicines to eastern Aleppo. After eastern Aleppo had been liberated, so many medicines were found at the storage facilities of fighters that the eastern Aleppo could not even imagine that many medicines. So as concerns those lies with white helmets and medicines in eastern Aleppo, we've made official requests to international structures because both factors were used to demonize Bashar al-Assad and to demonize those who were assisting him in fight against terrorism. Talking about lies, I've brought here a quotation so as not to forget. I knew that this question would be asked, so Russian Voice of America service, Mr. Galperovich quotation, I quote, statement of the US intelligence chief who accused Russian authorities of being involved into hacker attacks have not been commented in Russia by anyone who usually makes such comments. Not the Kremlin, nor the Foreign Ministry, nor heads of committees of both chambers of the parliament have made no comments with regard to accusations from Washington. That is the truth, the so-called truth of Voice of America, although Voice of America is lying when such statements were made by Voice of America. By that time, Mr. Peskov and Madame Zakharova had already have made their statements, but this garbage is being reported through this service, which is financed by the US State Department. So what? Probably some would like to forget that what Snowden had told 3 years ago, how the National Security Agency was hacking Al Jazeera and Aeroflot booking service, how video conference was hacked, how they eavesdropped on Hollande and Merkel, on the EU leaders. Well, remind your readers that these episodes that became known and that can be confirmed through facts have somehow passed unnoticed by those who are now crying and shouting based on the garbage that Russia is a cyber threat.
We still have got time for one question. BBC, so much has been said about this channel already today. Good afternoon, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask the question in English. But please take the mic.
Astana, I just wanted to ask you what you think realistically the talks on Syria in Astana can possibly achieve, given that so many major opposition forces won't be attending. So realistically, what can you do there? And you say Russia wants to improve relations with the United States. How likely is that, given the recent comments we've heard from members of Donald Trump's incoming administration calling Russia a threat? And does Russia really want to make up with America, or is it more interested in keeping an external enemy, a kind of bogeyman, a foreign bogeyman?
Что касается встречи в Астане,
As far as the meeting in Astana is concerned, you asked many questions. I should jot it down so as not to forget. The largest difference from all the other attempts is that this is going to be a meeting of people who have taken up arms to confront one another on the ground and who are in control of concrete territories in the Syrian Arab Republic. Up until now, the process which was launched in February by the United Nations only comprised the political opposition. As it turns out, most of these political opposition leaders do not have any influence, any clout on the ground. They cannot control those who in reality conquer new territories, but this process has been all but frozen because the so-called High Negotiating Committee, which was favored by the West and the regional countries, has taken a very capricious, so to speak, position, saying that it's not going to talk to anyone until Bashar Assad has gone. It was in gross violation of the UN Security Council resolution, which placed the process within the arms of the Syrian negotiators who were supposed to agree on things. So this negotiating committee of Syria, of political opposition, prevented Staffan de Mistura from performing the functions conferred upon him, and yet it got the support of certain European countries. There's Western countries favoring this committee. So together with the Turkish counterparts, we have come up with a proposal. Thanks to Turkey's mediation and thanks to our mediation, the armed forces of Syria and the armed opposition have arrived at an agreement on a ceasefire approved by the UN Security Council unanimously, and these agreements are to be observed. I do hope that some of the Western countries that have felt somewhat left aside by these agreements are not going to try to spite everyone else by undermining these agreements. We do hope that the responsible approach is going to be prevalent, triumphant, as opposed to the desire to remind everyone on one's existence and to spite everyone. So we do hope that Astana is going to comprise not just the political opposition into the fray, into the negotiation. The warlords have also to be included into these talks. As far as our future relations with the Donald Trump administration are concerned, I've already spoken about that, and there is not much I can add. The hearings have taken place in the Senate. Yes, there are attempts at giving a certain twist to them, a certain interpretation. I think this is quite pointless. What's important is the actions, the positions that are going to be announced once the team have arrived in power, finally, once they have moved in the White House. Just another remark, another observation. I've listened to the Senate hearings of Rex Tillerson. When answering the question about Russia, Mr. Tillerson said that the US had to look at the relations with Russia with open eyes. He said that Russia was a threat. But then he added, Russia is not unpredictable, he said, in promoting its interests. There were few who commented on that sentence. Maybe it was just overlooked. So when you say that Russia is not unpredictable in promoting its interests, means that the US is dealing with the people who are not going to just go on moralizing. The US is going to deal with someone who is going to try to comprehend the interests of their counterparts, of their partners, while promoting the interests of their own country. So getting back to that subject, to that controversy, messianism versus pragmatism versus promoting one's own interests, that's very important. If you concentrate on trying to find common ground, on trying to find shared interests, you can address many issues with many countries. Thank you very much. I would love to stay here, but unfortunately, negotiations are starting with the President of Moldova, which I have to attend. Thank you. Thank you very much for your attention and for your comprehension. Thank you. Goodbye.